Today I want to discuss what is, I think, one of the central concepts for Nassim Nicholas Taleb as he develops it in books like Skin in the Game and Anti-Fragile. That is the concept of ergodicity. It's something that lies in the background. He mentions it several times as crucial, but the definition of it is complicated and somewhat difficult to grasp, and so he leaves it in the background. But I think it's really central to understanding what this is all about. And once you understand the concept of ergodicity, you realize that a lot of what you see around you involves this sort of concept, and it makes you see things fundamentally differently. Because a lot of people sell policy ideas or business ideas or other things that are meant to improve people's lives, but in fact have the effect of, if I can put it this way, gumming up the system. What do I mean by that? A system is ergodic to the extent that time and ensemble probabilities coincide. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that over time, the dynamics of the system make it roughly equally probable that you might be within any given state in that system. So one way to think about this is to think about a bowl of oatmeal. You might pour milk in your oatmeal, you stir it around, and as you stir it, any particle of milk might be, and any particle of oatmeal might be anywhere, right? And so the stirring thoroughly mixes it. It is thoroughly ergodic. On the other hand, imagine mixing oil and water. They tend to separate. And so initially, it might be that you've got it looking well mixed, but then they separate again. And so over time, the oil tends to rise, the water tends to fall, and in general, it doesn't stay mixed up. It tends to revert to a system where what's on the top goes back to being on top. The effect is even stronger. If I put a rubber raft on a pond, it's going to stay floating there. It's not going to spend equal amounts of time over time on the bottom and on the top and everywhere in between. No, it's going to stay on the top, at least as long as it stays inflated. Similarly, if I take a rock and throw it into the pond, it's going to go down to the bottom and it's going to stay there. It's not going to spend an equal amount of time at any given level of the pond. So most systems are not very ergodic. Things tend to separate, if not by weight, by some other property, by density, by something. But what about societies? What about organizations? Well, it turns out ergodicity is very important. Often people are concerned with having people have the opportunity to rise from the bottom toward the top. But they don't realize that that entails the system has to be ergodic. And it means the people at the top have to be able to fall out of the top toward the bottom. Inequality is something we need to judge dynamically over time. And that's something people too rarely do. This is a failure of economic statistics, but it's also something that can disrupt our thinking about all sorts of things. In general, when you think about questions of equality and inequality, you have to think about entire lifespans. People as children tend not to earn much of any income at all. Then, as young people, they earn smaller amounts. As they age, they tend to earn more as they get better and better in their profession, take advantage of more and more opportunities and so on. But of course, there are things that can disrupt that and lead to sudden declines in income and so forth. And then finally, when they retire, typically, not always, but typically there's a decline in income and so on. And so if you think about that over an entire lifespan, and then think about the turn of the economy and where people fall in any given year of their lives, you realize they're in different places. For example, more than half the population is going to spend at least 1 year in the top 10% of income earners. A surprisingly high percentage, about a quarter of the population, is going to spend some time in the top 1% in a given year. And 75% are going to spend some time in the top 20%. So actually the dynamism of an economy tends to be quite significant. Who's on top and who's on the bottom keeps changing. That's why it's quite misleading to say, well, what percentage of income goes to the top 1%, and then track that across time. The people who comprise the top 1% may or may not be different people. Now, in a highly ergodic system, you could expect they're frequently going to be different people. In a system that is not very ergodic, they're going to tend to be the same people. And so we need to think when we contemplate equality or inequality in a company, in a society, in any kind of organization or structure. How dynamic is it? How much churning is taking place? Is it the same people who occupy certain positions, or are they constantly changing? And if we want people to be able to move up from the bottom, realize that entails we have to allow people to fall from the top toward the bottom. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "Sympathy for all would be tyranny for thee." And I think part of what he meant is that sympathy for all, in the sense of trying to keep anyone from falling, means everyone would be prevented from rising as well. If you want to allow people to rise to the top of the bowl of oatmeal, you've got to allow some to fall toward the bottom of the bowl of oatmeal. You can't raise those at the bottom without placing those at the top at risk, and without basically forcing them to have skin in the game. If they have nothing to lose, the others have nothing to gain. Upward mobility, in other words, has to come at the cost of downward mobility. There is no other way. Now, of course, a rising tide can lift all boats, as John F. Kennedy said, and so that's one way to have everybody gain. But if the idea is supposed to be that you want everybody to be above average, that's not going to work. If some people can rise into the top 10%, some people are going to have to fall out of the top 10%. And thinking of things in those ways, you realize that upward mobility and downward mobility are parts of the same thing. They are two sides of the same coin. Now let's talk about some problems, some things that gum up the works. One of them is tied to the treadmill effect. This is something Nietzsche talked about when he talked about values devaluing themselves. The idea is that we achieve a certain level, a certain aim that we've been striving for. And as soon as we do, we take it for granted and then start striving for the next thing. People tend not to be satisfied with what they have. They want more. At least certain kinds of people. Some people are pretty much immune from that. But if you want more and then, having achieved it, keep on wanting more, well then, you enslave yourself to a certain profession. You enslave yourself. A free person, Aristotle said, is somebody who can be free with their opinions. Somebody who can say what they think. Somebody who can actually do what they think is the right thing to do. Somebody who ends up doing something they would never otherwise do because, well, of societal pressure or economic pressure or something, is not free. A surprising number of people turn out in our current society not to be free by that criterion. They're too dependent on a paycheck or on a job and being thought of well by their peers. They're too dependent on other things. This includes people with tenure in academia. It absolutely amazes me. You would think that academia, being somewhat set apart, given that people after a certain length of time are given tenure so that they cannot easily be fired, they should be free to say what they think is true. In fact, academia is one of the most conformist places I've ever seen in my life. There are very few people who are willing to speak out against the consensus. Very few people who are willing to voice an unpopular opinion, take a stand against the crowd. And why? Why? What do they have to lose? I'm not sure I can fill in the answer. They think they're going to lose invitations to conferences. They think they're going to lose favorable mentions, that maybe somebody will decline to publish the next edition of their book. Well, big deal, I sort of think, compared to the risks that other people take in life. But still, it's enough to make people conform and to refuse to say what they think. They become enslaved to their profession. In general, we have a problem of ethical inversion, where instead of choosing a profession based on some ethical conception of what you ought to be doing and what you ought not to be doing, they change their ethics to conform to their profession. And so you find people saying all sorts of things that are really in the end self-serving. Educators telling you how important education is. Doctors telling you how important it is to be proactive in medicating people. And pharmaceutical companies telling you the same thing. You have business people telling you how important their product is for your life. Well, don't trust this, okay? Those people are shaping, and undoubtedly they're sincere views about what people ought to be doing, but they're shaped by their own professional interests. In the end, they're self-serving. Pay special respect to people who say things that are not self-serving, that in fact go against their own self-interest. Then maybe take seriously what they have to say, but recognize that too many people really do become slaves to their profession, are no longer free to say and to do things that they think they ought to be doing and saying, instead feel pressured to go along with the crowd and to not represent that client in law, for example, or to recommend that medicine even though internally they have that doubt, or to go along with the crowd and articulate things they know are wrong, even though, well, they should be free to say what they think in the classroom or in writing, but instead their peers are so committed to the other view, they don't want to rock the boat. Now we get to the problem of complexity. Taleb calls this the Alan Blinder problem. The difficulty is this. Regulators have a strong incentive to make regulations as complex as possible. The more complex, the more unintelligible the regulation, the more only regulators can actually understand what's going on. So there's a huge advantage to them to have complex regulations. The result of that is a negative for the rest of society, who get these heavily complex, difficult to comply with regulations imposed on them. Again, the upside goes to the insiders who would actually have this knowledge. The outsiders suffer. The more complex the regulation, in other words, the more it's prone to arbitrage by the insiders, the more they can take advantage of this and charge others for their expertise. But also, the harder it is to discern the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The harder it is to exercise ordinary human judgment. The more we end up with results that look bizarre intuitively, because we would think, well, wait a minute, why is it this way? Why is that? Well, it's regulations. And so anybody who's been in the military or anybody who's served in government agencies realize, yeah, there are things that you have to do and they make no sense. But that's what the regulations dictate. It's regulations. And it's very frustrating to be inside such a system. The complexity serves those who create the complexity. It doesn't serve the interests of anyone else. And in fact, it makes the entire system less likely to learn from experience, and so it makes it over time more fragile. In general, transfers of risk can impede learning. Remember that information can hide failure. The more data we have, in a sense, the more information we have, the easier it is to hide failure, but also the more bad information we have. It becomes very easy for a researcher to take a huge mass of data and find relationships that may or may not reflect real relationships in the world in the data. Just statistically, randomly, it's going to turn out that certain things are correlated. Well, the researcher can take this large database, can find some kind of relationships, can then publish that information, and doesn't tell you about all the other combinations of variables that would show no such relationship. In short, they can do research up to the point where they get a statistically significant result, and they just stop. And so they publish things based on statistical analysis that's highly selective and highly misleading. This has led to a replication crisis throughout the sciences. In social psychology, for example, a group has dedicated itself to try to replicate important results. So far, they've only been able to replicate about 30% of the results. That tells you 70% were really just a statistical artifact, something that we shouldn't have placed any trust in. It is even worse in medicine. Believe it or not, only about 10% of results published in medical journals replicate. That should frighten you next time you go to the doctor or find yourself in a hospital. The latest information in the medical journals has a 90% chance of being bogus. Education, learning, innovation, like disorder. But those in charge of systems, those in charge of institutions, don't tend to like disorder. Consequently, they don't tend to promote education, learning, innovation. They may say they do, they may say they're dedicated to it, but in fact, they tend to operate institutions in ways that are hostile to it. By encouraging people to get quick results without reflection, by encouraging them to publish spurious relationships, for example, by encouraging them to do things that can't be replicated, in general, by encouraging intellectual habits of conformity and of distortion that end up leading us away from knowledge. We see an increasing phenomenon in society of what Taleb refers to as intellectuals yet idiots. You might think of these as people with a lot of knowledge but very little wisdom. They are people who tend to think linearly. They miss complexity. They miss interdependencies. They don't engage in dynamic thinking. In general, they're pretty bad when it comes to higher order effects. And so they don't really understand what they're talking about at all as soon as they're dealing with complex systems, interdependencies, incentives, and other things that make it hard to predict the future. They have an overconfidence that things can be controlled and predicted. And we find such people increasingly in charge of our institutions, in charge of government, in charge of agencies, in charge of corporations or universities or even nonprofit institutions. They think the future is predictable, they think it's controllable. Neither of those things is true. Taleb gives us a few bits of moral advice at the end. One is, courage is the only virtue you cannot fake. Be courageous. Be willing to take risks and face the consequences of those risks yourself with dignity. Don't transfer the dangers of risks to others. Face them yourself. Don't engage in virtue signaling. Don't engage in rent-seeking. Don't try to steal optionality or convexity from others. And finally, start a business. Put yourself on the line. You think you're right about something? Put your money where your mouth is. In general, we want institutions that put people in charge who have their money where their mouth is, who have something to gain. They have incentives, but they also have something to lose. They have disincentives. When we have incentives and we have disincentives, the system tends to become stronger as a result of stress. It learns. It becomes anti-fragile. When people at the top do not have skin in the game, it becomes more and more fragile, and eventually it breaks. So we want people in charge who have something to lose, who are not transferring risk to others, but have the dignity, have the courage to accept it themselves.